We will hand over to the interpreters first, so they have the opportunity to present themselves and to hint that language and interpreting is always political. Good evening. As interpreting collective enterprise, we'd like to present ourselves and say something about language and interpreted events. Enterprise is a collective of people who have who do interpretation. Enterprise is we also want to raise awareness about the importance of interpreting. Like Susanna just said, language is not only a tool for communication, but is inherently political. It creates reality, it reflects and reproduces power structures. It creates or overcomes barriers depending on how we use it. Likewise, we want to give language mediation a face by being present as an initiative with its own political object, because it's often seen as a machine, because it is not a machine. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot, Lilo. That was, thank you.
In whichever time zone you are at the moment. I am Susanne Heek. I am Professor for Human Geography at Goethe University in Frankfurt on the Main. And after this pause between the years, I am glad to welcome you on behalf of our cooperation partners of Troubling Psyches. So that is the Institute for Social Research, Medico International, and the Institute for Human Geography. I am glad to, unfortunately, we have to conclude that the question on psychosocial dynamics and the effects brought about by the pandemic has not lost of its importance. From the wave to the wall, the change in graphic metaphorical representation of Omicron infections as a wall is alarmist, just as well as the rapid discontinuation of flight traffic with the African continent and also racist projections on the new mutation getting stronger again. The pandemic is neither over, nor are its interlinkings with the pandemics of racism, authoritarianism, and gender-based violence.
Wenn es nicht die Sehnsucht danach ist,
it's a we of empathy and solidarity in these circumstances, if it's not the longing to change the circumstances around us. Veronica Gago and Elsa Dorlan underlined that there is defense against those circumstances and their effects against fear and loneliness and powerlessness. But not only self-defense, also the defense of the other. Also in the pandemic, it's about, like Vanessa Thompson said, with Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, it's not only about analyzing social production and production circumstances of the wretched, but also to stay in relation with the wretched. In fact, in many places, it is those wretched of the earth that make possible our social reproduction. Their acts are the basis for communities functioning. Reproduction work, care work, is what holds the world together everywhere. But with exploited care workers, that brings about exploited care workers, and the pandemic shows this. Under the title, Care Against Exploitation, we want to raise questions on the basis of feminist critique of economy, as well as emotion, that touch care on the surface of social, that are on the surface of social discourse. How can we change a course of struggle and care into longing for revolution? So what are the challenges in that? What are networks of solidarity? Unfortunately, Cinzia Arruza,
der Leiterin der feministischen Menschenrechtsorganisation Aluna, wird deshalb an ihrer Stelle Julia Dück von der Stiftung sprechen. Über ihre Bereitschaft, kurzfristig zur Verfügung zu stehen, freuen wir uns sehr und sind auch sehr gespannt. Denn Julias Arbeitsschwerpunkte sind marxistische und feministische Gesellschaftstheorie, insbesondere gesellschaftliche Kämpfe um Care und Care-Arbeit in der Krise. Damit ergänzen ihre Perspektiven wunderbar die aktivistische Perspektive von Clemencia zur Fürsorge in der Polypandemie.
A Marxist and feminist social theory, especially social struggles around care in the crisis. Tonight's lecture will be facilitated by Jana Flörchinger, who is a freelance expert and author on feminist strategies and patriarchal violence in Germany and Latin America. She is
und als Aktivistin in vielfältigen
assistant on the Institute for Sociology
auch zum Thema
and the University of Jena.
Ich kenne Jana seit 2017, als wir gemeinsam mit Timo Dorsch und Börries Nähe den Kongress Geografien der Gewalt
vorbereiten,
wozu in der nächsten
actions and network concerning care. In the coming months, a publication about this will be published in Mandelbaum. I remember her vividly as a very creative and devoted person. Jana, the stage is yours. Thank you, Susanne, for this introduction, and thanks a lot from my side to Enterprise for their important work that makes visible how important language is and what power language has, which is actually one of the topics we will be discussing today. Therefore, from my side as well, a warm welcome to this last but one lecture, Care Against Exploitation. As Susanne said already, this series of lectures focuses on effects and consequences of multiple crises, at least exacerbated by the pandemic, but also it's about how social struggles can look like. The past lectures had their focus on how to deal with emotions of fear and confusion, and how social struggles can look like facing grief and anger during the pandemic. Today we will talk about subjectification during the pandemic, but also beyond. We, during the preparation, busied ourselves a lot with feminist critiques of economy, because the longing for ties, for bonds, takes into consideration people being in relation with each other, which shifts the focus strongly to care work. So we ask what effects and ties come from the experiences we make during the pandemic. So in how far do we find new points in life and ways of life, taking into account the immense inequalities? Veronica Gago and Elsa Durlin said, facing patriarchal violence and powerlessness in neighborhoods, but also across continents, what to do. So we want to connect with those thoughts tonight again, and we want to set a focus on relations and processes of relations and care. That is actions, care, practices of care that everyone is depending on. But the access to care is very unequal. Who profits from care? Why is it so unequal? And we can only take a look on this, taking into consideration sex, race, class, and gender. Rita Segato, mentioned by Susanne earlier, said in the series of lectures that the pandemic showed that care is something like what holds the world together. Feminists have enlightened or have highlighted this circumstance for the past 60 years. Yet she has a point. Rarely is it so obvious that care or care work is not being attached any value. Yet all people are dependent on care practices. That brings us, or me, to the point that care work has a very direct influence on social relations. So care and care work are preconditions for strengthening social fabric. At the same time, social care is at the center of social precarization, where care cannot be provided. But care is also present in its prosaicness. We have to see our mutual dependency, and we have to see we are providers of care and objects of care being provided at the same time. So the panel tonight is following the following questions. How have discourses and emotions around care and care work shifted in the wake of the pandemic? And what social dynamics have they triggered? Furthermore, we want to discuss to what extent can care or care work, taking into account their exploitative character, be the starting point for struggles? Where do we see resistance already? What are networks of solidarity we can relate to? Where do we see challenges when we see care at a starting point? So it's not last about how the pandemic changes us. Us is a fragmented we. It's a we that takes place in different places, that has to overcome borders. To look into those questions, we invited Clemencia Correa and Julia Dück. Julia is a specialist for social infrastructures with Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Her focus is Marxist and feminist social theory, gender circumstances, gender relations, social struggles around care and crisis. Clemencia Correa is a psychologist from Colombia. In 2013, she founded Aluna Acompañamiento Psicosocial, an NGO in Mexico that accompanies human rights defenders and journalists at risk. And it takes into account collective and intersectional approaches. For 30 years, she has been providing accompaniment to those affected by violence in the Americas. Also, she has conducted psychosocial evaluations before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Thank you to you both for taking the time to be present and to discuss with us tonight. We shall not forget that what is happening during the pandemic and the context in Germany and Mexico is very hard to oppose each other. So we invited two speakers from very different contexts to show the uniting aspects of care without forgetting the very different preconditions. And for example, this to care and social security systems. Thus, our two speakers show in very different ways that care work eludes being automatized and rationalized.
Diese neoliberal-kapitalistische Form beruht auf der Annahme
makes it go just opposite the way neoliberal societies
und diese Form
neoliberal
erschöpft systematisch
societies starts from the point of male white subjects to act on their own. So the pandemic makes it more difficult to regenerate. What challenges do we face because of that? So we have to take care as a starting point for different social relations. Clemencia, you advocate a critical discourse on how to deal with the pandemic. You problematize not only the psychological consequences, but also the effects on marginalized groups. The text you published with Eluna in the wake of the pandemic says it's very important to develop practices of collective care. Maybe Luna face the isolation and the threats people who work politically are facing during the pandemic. I would like to hand over to you to do that. Thank you, Jana and Julia. I'm so glad to be here with you tonight to talk about this subject. But also, I want to explain the framework of my work. With Eluna, we have a psychosocial approach. That is, we try to understand the consequences of political decisions and to trace them back to the social and political context. We try to take into consideration to connect political, social, and private factors. So power relations are very important for our work. I've been doing this work for many, many years. And the tools we use are not only psychosocial, but also political. It is a lot about security. Many people we work with, that we accompany, are exposed to great danger due to their work. So we have a psychosocial focus. That means it's not a clinical psychological approach. It is rather a different approach. It's a social approach that looks into what certain developments and decisions do to people. So it's rather a pedagogical approach than a clinical approach. That implies that we have to take into consideration the political side of things. We have seen social relations breaking off due to political decisions or the pandemic, etc. So that means what has COVID to do with an intersectional perspective? That is what I would like to talk about today. I want to underline that it's not possible to analyze the pandemic separate from social and political developments and changes. So you have to watch it from an intersectional perspective. You have to see the categories of race, gender, and class. So that was just a brief introduction. Now, coming to the context of the pandemic. Concerning the pandemic and the COVID virus, there are many different consequences. All of them influence our subjectivities, the individual ones, just as the collective ones. For us, that means the following. We name that a psychosocial trauma to understand how this pandemic works and how it influences us and our subjectivity. We are talking about
cuando estamos hablando de trauma psicosocial nos está implicando una ruptura de estructuras en las relaciones y efectivamente el daño que se produce
COVID-19 is comparable with violence solamente de manera social level. So psychosocial trauma with political subjects shows itself with fear, powerlessness, with being tired, with breaking of social relations. So there's mental, emotional, and physical consequences for those active politically. So these consequences are overlapping with the context of socio-political violence we are witnessing in Mexico for decades, which is like corruption, impunity, human rights violations. So that's our starting point. We try to start there and to accompany human rights organizations and activists. We try to visibilize an economic structure that has been existing for a long time, but that has not been addressed yet. Mainly in the area of human rights, people who advocate human rights are especially afflicted by these forms of violence. Our accompaniment starts with different factors. We accompany individuals, but also organizations. And that's something I would like to explain because it's the framework, it's the context of the work we do. Something that we do as well, and that Rita Segat mentioned earlier in this series of lectures, is that we focus a lot on class politics. Class politics have a lot to do with health and healthcare system. There's people with more power and influence, and it's about thinking about who makes political decisions and what consequences do for different margins want to make clear and visible with Aluna. Starting at that point, we want to help people to cope with the pandemic, but also to stay resilient and to withdraw activism. And thus, we want to strengthen local groups and individuals. In the wake of the pandemic, we have been seeing violence, gender-based violence, exacerbating, and the problems of the labor, the working class, growing. One last thing concerning the context of our work is the following. I want to talk about the virtual consequences of the pandemic. So it's the technologies we use. Those technologies change relations. Now, this is our framework. And that being said, I want to talk about some of the most consequences and effects of the pandemic and what they did to us and Aluna. I'm not saying we have solutions, but we have tools and our own means to counter the problems we face. Maybe later we'll have a little more time to go into it a little deeper. Now, from a psychosocial perspective, looking at political subjects and the pandemic, I can say the following. Something that a very important effect is the area of work. We could not accompany people in person. So already that relation was ruptured. We had to struggle to reach the people, and all the personal connections got severed due to the pandemic and the restrictions. So that makes trust and trust building to people and local projects much difficult. So virtual work really rupture in our way of working. We could not meet anymore. There were no more live encounters. That has been the same all over the world. So with measures of protection, we stay in contact, but the same is true for all social and personal relations. It's difficult to keep them alive. I want to talk also about socio-political violence. That is something essential to the pandemic and essential to dictatorship. It is easier to carry political ideologies to the people, to repeat them endlessly. There is no possibility to get into a direct exchange. So political analyses are very important for our work. So for us, it's incredibly important to counter the analysis of the great mass media, to bring our analysis to the people, because our perspective on culture, the world, and the pandemic is something very different than the one being transmitted via mass media. Another factor is powerlessness. So on a psycho-emotional level, we are seeing that there's a lot more, a growing amount of insecurity and powerlessness. So the knowledge about the pandemic, all of that is a consequence of the pandemic. In that context, we worked with organizations to transmit knowledge so they can see that on an individual and collective level, there is still a margin, there is still something safety, and in midst of all the news and chaos, we want to encourage people to take on responsibility and to take their actual decisions. It's largely about people who are insecure, who have questions. Strengthening our approach, our analysis, infecting yourself, of infecting others, loved ones. And it's really about how to deal with this fear. That's something we try at Aluna. Of course, there is different forms of fear, but still it is so important to accept their existence, to acknowledge them, to see them, and to find a means of dealing with them. We have tried to counter those forms of fear with collective answers. It is very important to distinguish between fear and risk. It is not about heightening fear, about strengthening fear, but about seeing that a risk is something we calculate, we can foresee. We have to find a balance and risk. There is measures of prevention, but also reactionary measures, and we have to distinguish between those two. Another very important factor is to speak about grief and mourning is extremely important. We try to take on a critical perspective on that. Of course, we have different rituals to deal with grief. We can still not really estimate what this ongoing mourning for a former way of life, for all those social relations being ruptured, what this ongoing process of grief does to us. In accompaniment of grief, we are also working on grief. We try to teach people on how to recognize stress and a sense of guilt. It is about reasserting an everyday life, not many people are mourning the life they had before the pandemic. They don't see that everyday life is already shattered. It is not existent anymore. So I'm trying to, I'll jump to the end now. I want to talk about guilt. We also try to teach people on how to deal with guilt. Guilt about infecting someone, guilt about losing a loved person due to the pandemic. So it's about teaching the people what is their own responsibility and what is beyond that. This differentiation helps to find the right tools and means and to relieve yourself from guilt that is not individual guilt or not individual responsibility. What we think is very important concerning feelings of guilt is to develop a sense of responsibility and to take on responsibility for each other within political organizations. It's not about following measures the government or the cities are imposing. It is about looking into collective measures and implementing collective measures. So it's always the question, whose fault is the situation? Who is guilty in the situation? And it's very important to answer to this question in a very differentiated manner. So it's really about collective responsibility in political projects, but also on an individual level. So coming to a close, I want to say that although all seems very horrible, we focus as well on positive aspects. The collective care we see is something that is being tried, is being put into action and is being developed. And that's somewhere we can start. I'm not only talking about women helping each other, I'm talking about men integrating into social and care and solidarity networks. And that is very important to create a project. We face a lot of challenges, but the most important is to have to our relations, our mutual relations. So we have to leave this individualist logic and take on a communal, a collective perspective. There's a lot of friction, a lot of problems, but the core of our work is not losing the relation with each other, making them better and developing collective care that is strengthening each other mutually. We have to ask ourselves, how can we use this virtual space to strengthen each other collectively and mutually? So we shouldn't see it as something that controls us, but as a tool we can use to keep relations with each other. So many things function only in the digital world at the moment, but how can we own that? How can we make it our tool and own this situation? So that were the key points.
Thank you, Clemencia, a lot for your input. Really, really interesting input for your work. Thank you that you also hint to this distinguishment of fear and risk. I think that's a really, really important thought in this whole dealing with the pandemic situation, but also in general with the multiple crises we have to deal with that are beyond the pandemic, actually. because risk actually means that we have something that we can calculate, but fear is always something that is really confused. That reminds me a little bit at Carlos Beristain, that you also know. He once said that we have to move from confusion to complexity in order to remain capable of acting in a political constellation, because this understanding of this violence that we experience is, of course, the basis to stay capable of doing something. So that's what you are actually doing with your work. And you have this approach of a mutual understanding of the situation, where, of course, you have all this experience in Luna. I mean, you work since for a lot of years in this area, and therefore you have this mutual dealing with the situation. And about those collective strategies to be there for each other can also be a political praxis. And I'd like to hand over to you, Julia, and maybe you can just add something to this thought of a political strategy about the strike in the care sectors in Berlin last year that already started before the pandemic situation, actually. It was, of course, other conditions, and it had other debates, but now we discussed about COVID-19 a lot. We also spoke about the ideological attack on care, and maybe you can explain what you mean with that. How is that connected to the term of crisis? What is about the thinking, the acting, and the feeling of the subjects? Thank you a lot. I'm delighted that I can be here tonight with you, replace the other speaker, and that I can speak about our subject, care against exploitation. I would like just to continue with the thought of Jana, that the crisis, that this crisis is a crisis of social reproduction, and I will speak about this now. So the crisis of social reproduction was not created by the pandemic, but it was intensified by it. And I want to give you also an example of the struggles in the hospitals. But I'd like to say at first, speak about the term crisis, because with crisis of the social reproduction, of care, and so on, this term, we already see that there's a lot of different things that we can mean by it, actually. So what I'd like to do first is to explain what kind of concepts of crisis we have, and then also tell you what my approach is to this subject, and also show how, with this basis, I look at the struggles in the hospitals and what I see at the moment, and how those crises get intensified, and also what this has to do with this attack in an ideological way that was just mentioned. So if you look at the crisis of the care sector and the social reproduction, then we have two different concepts of crisis, which we could distinguish in this debate. And this is how we could structure this debate. So the one thing is the crisis of the social reproduction, and is used, you could say, a physical destruction of humans. So that means that every day, but also on the level of generation, people cannot reproduce themselves anymore. And this concept of crisis is linked to a Marxist feminist understanding of what social reproduction means. That is that capitalism is dependent on reproduction of humans. So every day, because it has to keep up the production, but also in a generational way, because people quit from production processes, and that's why we need new people to step in. So if we talk about crisis in this sense, we have an everyday and generational reproduction, and if those are not functioning anymore, because, for example, the conditions changed, because there's no time, because nobody does it anymore, because people are exhausted. So that is one concept of crisis in this debate. And the other one, the other concept would be a term that goes more in the direction of care. And this approach means with crisis something that there's no good care possible anymore. So it's not appropriate anymore. So the theoretical background there is more from the care research, and that means more with care, something that has special characteristics. So they have a subject-subject relationship, so that care can only be done if we really have building up relationships, and it's not everything based on time. So it's not a profit-oriented capitalist organization. It is not measurable. You cannot make it rationalized. So when we speak in this perspective of crisis, and this, then we say that this cannot be realized anymore. So if paid cared work is rationalized and making impossible in some terms. I think both concepts of crisis I will speak about, but of course there's an additional perspective on this crisis that I like to stress, and I like to present that now. And I use the term crisis of habits, and the other term would be the crisis of gendered subjectivities. It is also linked with Marxist feminist critiques that capitalism is dependent on the production of human workforce, but not only on this everyday generational reproduction, and that people need to have the qualification to keep up production, but also that people need to go to work actually, and that the conditions must be okay. And I will talk about Gramsci, who developed that further with the theoretical gender. That means that capitalism is not only based on the physical reproduction of people, but also on the social and political and ideological reproduction of people. That means people are also influenced on their gendered subjectivities. So it's not only necessary that they need to have enough food, sleep, recovery, free time, education, and abilities, but also the question is, what do they actually eat? What do they think is free time for them? What do they think, and what do they strive for, and what they want to reach in their lives? So that is more a question of capitalist subjectivity and reproduction. That is important in terms of what actually a crisis changes. So what I described before, the crisis of social reproduction as destruction of human resources, explains crisis the following. As social reproduction theory, for example, that we have the starting point that capitalism and social reproduction, we can explain that it's necessary, but actually in the basis contradictory. So it's basically contradictory because capitalist conditions have this tendency to lower the wages and to devalue the workforce. So therefore, always shorten the possibility for reproduction. With Gramsci, I would explain this correlation, the following, and add a little bit to that. So the correlation of capitalism and social reproduction is, like I just explained it, mostly with the perspective on economic circumstances, but actually there's includes a bit more. It's actually more we need to speak about. It's the correlation of production, relations of ways of living and of gendered ways of living. Of course, we could also add race in this discourse. That's also always the point. So Gramsci makes an example in the Fordism, for example, but I will give you another example with hospitals. But Gramsci describes this in Fordism. He describes the development of the assembly line work. So there he says that there's another way of production, and then you have other demands and the ways of living and the subjectivity for the people who work. So assembly line work needs people who is relaxed, who can do all those working steps that are really structured in assembly line work. And of course, also that they don't do extreme drinking, and they don't do occasional sexual satisfaction. So in the morning they would be like really tired and would not come to work though. Or maybe fell asleep at work because they cannot, and then they cannot do this precise work they need to do. So what Gramsci wants to show with that is that productivity is correlated with production processes. So if we look at the crisis, we need to say that maybe we have cutbacks of the social welfare state, that we have established reduction in every areas of the work, but that doesn't necessarily need to be seen as crisis by the workforce, because maybe they arrange with it, maybe they're all right with that. Maybe there's something like quality time with the family just for certain occasions, but that doesn't need to be this circumstance that people think that it's a crisis. Maybe you can order your food via your internet, or you can ask other people to clean your house. So doesn't need to be seen as a crisis. You just change your way of life. So about the changing of the production process and of the gendered way of life and the subjectivity of people, and there's always the question of how does the production process change, and how does that change the demands of subjects? And does that lead to a crisis, or does it just change the habits of people? So people adapt to the circumstances and don't see it as a crisis. And on the other hand, we maybe have new established gendered ways of life and habits that maybe lead to the fact that some ways of working are not accepted and that they cannot persist, because a lot of people counter to that and are not ready to do this work. So now maybe a short break on the perspective, actually, because the perspective I just explained before. I would like to speak about hospitals, how the social reproduction relations change, and how can we describe this? And if we have this understanding of crisis, what can we see then in hospitals? So I start with two different changings in hospitals. The first one is economization. in hospitals. And that's mostly about because of the diagnosis-related group system, the DRG. This is a financial model that was introduced 2005. And this model is not covering all the costs, but it has fixed rates for certain therapies. So if hospitals operate in the red, if they are over this fixed rate, and if they're below this fixed rate, they can get profit. So this system just produced concurrence and pressure, economical shortages, and a lot of reduction in staff. All the areas which were not directly related to patients were outsourced. And on the other hand, we had increase in revenues. So we had more case counts and more patients, and also a focus on lucrative therapies. So those treatments that are more valued in the system of the DRGs. So in the end, this leads to the fact that we had a lack of personnel, but also an intensification of work because they had to care for a lot more patients. So with this Gramsci feminist approach, we can also find another aspect of the changing in the hospitals. Okay, should we speak a little bit more slowly? Should we have a short break so that we can interpret? So if we have our perspective, like I explained, the Gramsci feminist perspective on hospitals, which I explained 5 minutes ago, then we can see next to this process of economization, we can see this professionalization of care work. So the political ideological regulation of the habits and way of life is shown in the hospitals. What happened in the last years in hospitals is not only this reduction of staff and the intensification of work and outsourcing, which leads to more profit, but also supposed female and care activities were outsourced and were devalued. And other aspects like documentation, medical practices, and work sharing gained importance in the hospitals. And they did this in 2 areas even, because there was more pressure because of the circumstances that I just explained. So there was this reduction of staff and outsourcing of certain activities and decrease of number of beds. So there's this time pressure that a certain kind of care work and social demands and relationship work is just structurally limited at the moment because there's not enough time. But it's not only a question of structural conditions, but also the imagination or the definition of what is good care. Because parallel to this new financial model, this DRG system, the formation changed. So the conversation with the patient, which normally helps the patient to deal with fear and sorrows. So this changed in the formation of care workers in the 70s or 80s. It was very central in this formation, but now that changed. Now they have only little space in this formation. And it's always spoke about that we can give standardized information instead of conversation and more work sharing, so that certain activities are more handed over to assistants, and other people, like the academic part of the stuff, is not doing the so-called dirty work anymore. So what happens in the hospitals is not only the changing of the capitalist way of production, but also the habits, the thinking, the actions of the care workers are reorganized, you could say disorganized, and it's disorganized what is understood as good care. So it's also devalued. At the same time, it's tried to reinforce ideologically with the professionalization of care. So people say it's a professional care. It's more focused on medical work and not on really caring for patients. How does that lead to crisis? There are two levels I'd like to point out. I will not stress the time too much. The point is that we have two reasons for crisis and struggles that are happening right now. One thing is that I just mentioned is if the way of production changes, also the demand on the gendered way of life and productivity changes. So certain kinds of care is devalued and is also outsourced and get less importance. And that leads to crisis because care workers, in the belief of good care, think that actually those things are important and they are against those forms of devaluation. And on the other hand, we can see that those changing habits, this changing thinking and this changing thinking about good care, but where people have this this belief what good care is and was beforehand, they cannot do that anymore because they don't have enough time. So it's not only a crisis of exhaustion, but also a crisis of gendered habits, routines that are not possible to do anymore. So what already happened before the pandemic, the strikes, they are happening even more right now during the pandemic, and they are happening because there are struggles against the economization, against reduction of staff and for dischargement. But I would say it's also feminist struggles, because it's not only for more staff, but also for the understanding of what good care is. And my really last point about this is during the COVID-19 crisis, what Jana said in the beginning already, we have this focus on, or this aggregated social crisis in reproduction. And we have a lot of more time pressure and cost pressure and more patients to care for, but also we have this intensifying of this crisis because the reasons are becoming visible, and there's a social understanding, a societal understanding how hospitals are organized, and that is actually a problem, that they're organized in a capitalist way. Because there's this phantasma of the sovereign subject, and that's also intensifying in the pandemic, because if people die all alone, then you can see this cruelty. And it's not only everyday life in the pandemic situation, but it is everyday life in a hospital that is organized, profit-orientated. It was already common before the pandemic, but now it is visible and we can speak about it. And it can be a starting point for societal solidarity and for valuation of care work.
Yes, thank you very much, Julia, especially concerning what you last said, the cruelty of isolation being everyday life before the pandemic even, and the difference being now that for the first time during this pandemic, it became clear that this can influence a social debate. So thanks for making this very clear, which is a little complex. So the care strikes in hospitals, and also what we heard from Clemencia, what's connecting those two is that on one hand, the psychosocial accompaniment as relationship work, as Clemencia put it, but also the strikes for better working conditions, to do better care work, to do more of the caring part of care works, care jobs. That shows that certain processes based on care elude automatization and being rationalized. So that counters the assumption of autonomous subject in neoliberal societies. We now have 25 minutes for the discussion of relationships. Capitalism systematically undermines our collective and individual capacities for regeneration of people, and thus the keeping of relationships and ways of relations. So what's being represented in very different humans are dependent on relations. That's what I would like to discuss with you now. I would like to take care as a starting point and ask, to what extent can we the ways of life and relating to each other, and where do we see challenges in that? What can be difficulties? Yeah, maybe you can start. What is your take on that? Can relationship work be a starting point to talk about new ways of relating to each other?
Yo creo que hablaste ahora de un término que me parece que es importante diferenciar y acotar. Pienso que es importante el autocuidado, diferenciarlo del cuidado colectivo.
I'm not sure if I have
Se ha utilizado el tema de autocuidado de una manera muy subjetiva e individualista. Creo que hay que tener también
self-care is important, and that collective care is very important. I find that self-care, individualist way, about both being important, connected with collective So self-care is all ourselves, which is obvious, but this concept of self-care does not, it must not remain with one person only. Right, there was an interruption. I should talk a little slower. So I have been talking about the notion of to develop one's own methods to care for oneself. Which is not only yoga or sports, but a lot more than that. So it's about those practices not only being limited to one person, but so it's not about individualistic self-care that helps capitalism go on as had, but it's about collective care. Mutual care is what we should strive for. That's my first point. The second would be care has to take on a pedagogical perspective. All organizations with whom we work are about what do we mean when we say health. The notion of health is very important. It's not only about physical health, it's about mental health. What does it mean to have a good healthcare system? We started to talk about mental health at the beginning of this evening. Very often, it's being left out of considerations. Through capitalism and the pandemic, we see that we don't only suffer physically, but also emotionally and mentally. The most important is that we regard ourselves in relation with our environment, that is the people around us and nature around us. So we have to find an integral concept of health. That is something we focus on in our work. It's work for a community and with a community. The third point is to talk about dignity when we talk about care. It's not only about pointing to and reacting on the consequences and effects of the pandemic. We have to think about the other person, and to see the other person, the person that is not present. We will see more and more effects of this pandemic. So to care for myself means to take others into account. At the moment, I see a fundamental dilemma in that. When taking care of yourself means distancing from others, that is problematic, because it is not about rupturing relations. We should keep them. That's important from a political perspective as well. That is really what makes it so difficult, because we can't encounter each other in real life in fear of infection. So we have to think about how to strengthen and how to keep our relationships in spite of the pandemic and all the limitations. For us as a country with a lot of human rights professionals and human rights advocates, it's about having each other and being in networks, because so many of us are exposed to dangers and are being threatened, and being isolated, being alone is the worst thing that can happen to us, and which renders us a lot more vulnerable already. So it's very difficult often. The official politics argue that official demonstrations should not take place because of danger of spread of the pandemic, which makes us isolated. So how does repression work through technological control, through digital tools? That are important point to take into account this virtual world and all the changes it brings about, to analyze those and not to let them separate us. We have to challenge and analyze the role of technology.
So what we can state is that care is always a collective process, of course, also caring for yourself, but also the responsibility for other people. Maybe, Julia, you could answer to that. What you just told us, the strike in the care sector has a completely different point of start than human rights activists that were also already there before the pandemic, where it is about to stay a political subject. But how would you answer that, how I understood Clemencia, relations and is always taking responsibility in collective processes? I would like to stress the point that Clemencia said. You asked if care can be a starting point of a solidarity relationship, of solidarity relationships, and thus care can be the center of a changing for an emancipatory changing in society. And I'd like to continue from that point, not always, because care can be used as functioning for capitalism. That's actually the point what I wanted to stress in my input, because care is not, or care relationships are not from itself rational, can be rationalized actually. That's what's happening in the hospitals at the moment. That's where care is separated from supposed feminine work. And that can lead to contradiction. It does that sometimes at the moment, but it can also lead to a new perspective on what is good care. So the question is, what do we understand about care in our society, and how we try, and how capitalism is trying to own this? And so I think that's an important point you just mentioned in a political way. So we need to distinguish between self-care without devaluing it and a collective care practice. Therefore, I think this is a really important point. So I would say care relationships are not in itself something good, but they can be used for resisting praxis against the establishment or the established circumstances. But also there, it is important to speak about what we actually mean in those care relationships. So what does something like a dignified care mean? It is a really important buzzword. We cannot only speak about this thing that the medical life to keep bodies alive. It is not only about that. It is also outside of hospitals about more. Of course, can we have a dignified therapy? Can we accomplish that? And we see that in the strikes. They say it again and again that there are important aspects of work, like, for example, that care workers always report what happens in their work, that things are devalued, like I didn't have any time to care for the haircut of my patients. It also is part of a dignified therapy. Also, if people would, of course, not die if it's not done. So the question there is what we as society understand as a dignified care. And this can also be a collective praxis, therefore. So this solidarity transformation can come out of this, but it's not something that happens automatically. It is kind of a part of a debate in society, a process, therefore, which is stressed in the strikes at the moment actively. It's, of course, not only a question of care workers, but also of people who are potential patients, what they think is dignified care. It can not only be a question of the staff of a hospital, but also of people who get treated. Thank you. Before I continue, of course, you can react to each other if you want. I don't have to do that. You can do it autonomously. What I like to conclude now is this aspect of collective care. Julia, you said collective care is always something that always has something with a democratic societal debate. So this collective care means an integral full human health. And I'd like to stress a bit more the point of, or this level where we have these relations that get more and become more invisible. Of course, they have all those ambivalent aspects, but how could a solidarity dealing with those also care relationships and in the context of the pandemic? So what could we learn from those care relations, and also from parts of this logic of care relations, to have Corona or COVID as a specific crisis moment, and what can we learn now from those care relationships that are happening now? Maybe Clemencia, you can start. I mean, you are dealing.
En que efectivamente ver la pandemia en general pues nos implicaba la
see them in a collective context. I think it is very important to underline that and to see the pandemic as a whole. We see, or we have talked already about power relations. In my view, we have to be clear on the possibilities and on everything we find within the framework of solidarity. We can analyze those relations in different ways. I think that there is dilemmata, there is challenges we have to work on. On one hand, that is human relations. They are about a social
en general, ¿no? O sea, si por algo nos caracteriza a los seres
and about showing human behavior in society and work with other people and showing effect. Emotion. Unfortunately, in capitalism, emotion has to be controlled. So emotion that is being controlled over a longer period of time, we lose the relation to emotion and we don't know anymore what that is. So at the moment we have a lot of control over that. Also, I think for building up those relations, we need trust. And when I want to be with a person, work with a person, I have to let this other person express themselves, and I have to let myself express myself. So when I'm afraid of the other person's emotions, that becomes very difficult. So we need trust and emotions, and trust into the other person, and trust in ourselves to strengthen our ties. This is not only about fear, but also, as I said, about guilt. How can I enter into a relationship without this thought of guilt? It's very difficult. I think that we must strengthen solidarity, and we have to put the damages and the problems into their context. When we want to build a relationship to another person, it is very important to understand the problems the other person has, the problems this other person lived through. We, of course, do not find ourselves all in the same circumstances. So when we find common ground, we can start working from. When we find a common level, common grounds, that is one first step. So we don't see the single mother with her children. We can't see how this person behaves in crisis. So we have to be very clear on the concrete conditions, social, economic conditions that give us the possibility to build relationships. When we talk about those relations today, we see that a lot has been lost. Solidarity has to strengthen those relations and the conditions for interpersonal relations. And it has to strengthen resistance against politics, against certain circumstances, with trust, to impede the fear that has come upon us. Of course, we have to care about ourselves, but still we have to approach ourselves. Care today is about human relations. We need human relations for providing care. Of course, COVID is a big topic, but we must not forget the structural violence behind that. We have the pandemic, but the pandemic diminishes the other problems, supposedly diminishes the other problems we have, which is, for example, the structures of power. We must not look on the pandemic in an isolated manner. We see the vulnerability of the people every day, but it's not only existent due to COVID, but also due to structural reasons. Thanks a lot, Clemencia, and thanks for really putting forward the point of how important trust is in relations and ways of relating to each other. Julia, maybe you, in what you said in your input already, you assume that relationship work in the context of care strikes or struggles in hospitals bases on the knowledge that there is a need for care, that there is a dependency of being provided care, of which a hairdo is part, just as well as other forms of care. Maybe you as well can elaborate a little on what Clemencia just said about trust and emotion. So what does this care imply? as and that is supposedly not that important. Yeah, I find fascinating, and this point is what Clemencia just said. I find fascinating that fear and guilt are a means of governing in this crisis. Emotions are being taken up by political decision makers, and they tried to, or people try to regulate the populations with those emotions. So fear is a big emotion that is really universal and paralyzing, and calculating between risk and fear is opening up a social promise to be able to fight your fear if you just behave in the right manner. And this right manner to behave is not a democratic decision or like a decision process. It is part of governmental policies. So that's what I took from your point, Clemencia, that it's being used to say demonstrations are a place of infection, that the connecting to each other, the caring for each other is a danger to other people or to each other even. And at the same time, we see this great contradiction, because in all sectors that are economically relevant and that have to go on, it is not impeded to have connections, to have people sitting right next to each other, working with very close physical contact without there being a discussion on infection. So it's a calculation of risk that is an interpretation of what is being understood as a danger, or what is being propagated as a danger. So it's the one question is, how do we understand this crisis? What are our offers we can make as analysis of the reasons for the crisis? So one of the very early points in Clemencia's input was, it's about making your own analysis more visible. And it's very important, in my view, to show that misery in hospitals did not come up suddenly during this pandemic. And that it's important to say that we would have been prepared much better for this pandemic if the hospitals had not been reorganized in a profit-orientated manner long before. Had we not had massive cutbacks on personnel, had we not had cutbacks on beds, had we not had this pressure, this business pressure in hospitals, we would have been better prepared, which would not say that we are immune to great numbers of infections. But I'm just trying to make the point, anger, grief, and guilt are not beyond the sphere of power relations. They are a part of governmental policies. That is why I find the notion of risk a little difficult, because risk implies exactly this imagination of calculability and control. So risk becomes part of biopower calculations of society that have been done before the crisis. For example, with relation to the insurance system, if you just live healthy enough, if you eat healthy enough, you reduce your risk to become ill, and you reduce your cost to society. And that is why I find we have to look into what are the notions with which we interpret this crisis, and how can we open up another realm of analysis of meaning from this crisis. That shows very clearly that a careless subject that walks on this earth and through society without any worries, this is a phantom that has been made clear by the pandemic, and that profit-orientated reorganizations that have been processed during the past years, they are a problem that has become clear. So that's why I think we have to think about how to counter that tendency with relations of solidarity. Thank you for making it that concrete. And I think that the question of how we understand crisis and how we analyze this and how do we transmit those analyses to the public is very central. And also what you said was the end, that the myth of an autonomous subject has become highlighted by the crisis. And we have to think about how to counter this tendency with relations that center on solidarity.
Looking at the time, I would like to take some questions from the chat. Maybe, Julia, you can tell us what the chat is asking. There are some questions, actually. In the chat, there are a lot of questions, which we can maybe conclude to one big question, because I just noticed that you have different realms. Julia, you asked how resistance is developing from different contradictions. And Clemencia, you ask more what in care is important to resist in resistance. Julia, you say that care is not in itself a contradiction to capitalism. We need to go a bit beyond that until we really have this ways of relationships that are really resisting against capitalism and can change something. One question relating to this point is you stress the point of the importance of collective care practices. Could you maybe make a bit more concrete which kind of practice you mean with that? I mean, it's a really different form of care that what is noticed normally. And maybe there's another question, which is more for Clemencia, which is related to that. A question about the cuerpo territoria, so the body territory in English, which was coined in the Americas and central struggles there in feminist activists. And maybe you can explain a bit more the situation in Mexico for people who are sitting in Germany at the moment. So the central question is about the collective questioning, central organizing and reproducing struggles.
Cuando nos referimos a toda esta parte, digamos, de construcción colectiva, nos referimos a un trabajo concreto con organizaciones, colectivos, comunidades diferentes para nosotros sujetos.
So it is about a work which is all over, and not only individuals, but also organizations. It is about demanding human rights and also to understand our territories as our bodies as territorials. So what did we reach in the last years? It is a lot about to crystallize, to focus on the conditions to survive in the context of political violence. So that means now it's also about the pandemic. And that is really important for us and also for the organizations In the beginning, we thought we can not accompany the people in the psychosocial way anymore at all. But now we have some practices how we can support each other anyways. We work with civil society organizations, and they support people from society. So it's like a chain. In the core, it is about the care of the community, actually. So a central aspect of this is the security, because people who we are accompany, they have a great risk. So the people, we need to protect them, but also in their work, they need this security. It's about preventive work, and also to understand those measures and have them ready how to react if people are infected. It's really important to not feel paralyzed. So, for example, if a whole organization is infected, then we all know already how we need to react. So people who are, or organizations that are in contact with those organizations, they directly know what to do. And this is the agency that is ready to apply. For a lot of people, it's also an economical factor. So there was a lot less money, there was financial losses. And so it was a precarization of those organizations. Especially the small organizations were affected by this. So there it's about how can we keep those projects alive? How can we restart them? And because they're missing during the pandemic. Another problem is that a lot of organizations and a lot of more threats were there. There was more violence, more threats, and that made them more vulnerable. The patriarchal system in itself is full of violence, actually, but through the pandemic, it got even worse. Of course, also this violence went into those personal relationships, and people got a lot more vulnerable in their individual environment. Because also there we try to help organizations. Those are just some examples. And the distinguishment between fear and risk is, like I said, really important. For example, we have some guidelines or some advice how we can deal with those things, and we handed them out to the organizations. And I'd like to mention something interesting. In Colombia, but also in Mexico, we had the situation that there were a lot of changes. A lot of people had no access to the healthcare system. So in fact, those people that didn't have this access had to find help somewhere else. For those people, it was mostly about to develop their own practices or their rituals just to cope with the pandemic situation. And so also those forms of organization are important. I mean, the healthcare system is really important, but not everybody has access to it. So the pandemic is already there for 2 years, and those practices are helping us a lot, actually. I mean, we can hope that COVID will be finished at some point, but the structural violence will still be there. And that's an important point in our structural analysis. So all the people, no matter which circumstances they're in, they need to cope somehow with the situation. And this is also a realm where we are working in a lot. That's a South American perspective, I could say. Latin America, sorry. So we not all, like our bodies we should not look them only from a physical perspective, but also from a mental, like psychological perspective. So there are indigenous and Afro-American communities that often don't have so much access to a healthcare system, and we need to understand that it is about our body, the bodies of women, of the marginalized, and we need to defend those bodies. So it is about to minimize the influence on our bodies, the charge that is on our shoulders, on the shoulders of the human rights defenders. It is very, very heavy, and we need to start from there, from those people. This is, again, the principle of self-care that I already mentioned. So that means concrete that everybody is concerned by the pandemic, physically and emotionally. If it is just your everyday work or other work that is not paid, everything got a lot worse. So we need to learn to deal with those emotions and to analyze them and to cope with the pandemic in this way. The last thing I want to say about Mexico, there's one advantage, we could say, and I mostly stress here the government of Mexico. What Bolsonaro did in Brazil, for example, was a disaster. It was really horrible. But and concerning the vaccination, we could say in Mexico, at least, the majority of the population is vaccinated. In Honduras and Brazil, this is not the case. And so this is a really good point we have in Mexico. A lot of experts are specialized in Mexico on the pandemic. So they try to help us also, even if the healthcare system is really weak and it has a lot of failures, but there are always people who work for a change, for a transformation. Another thing is there's no obligation for vaccination. There are people who don't want to be vaccinated because of their view on the world. That is, of course, a problem. We need to deal somehow with that. Of course, there are a lot of weak points in our healthcare system, but if we compare it to other Latin American countries, here at least almost everybody is vaccinated, and that is at least something. And a last point, unfortunately, I also have to say that the COVID policies exploits the fears and the emotions of the people in Mexico, Honduras, and Colombia. The COVID is really used to influence people concerning the elections, for example. It's a political subject that the politicians try to use for themselves. I think, like we think, that in Brazil and in Central America, it is the worst, that COVID is really used as a political mean to convince people. Thank you. What you just described, that it's some individual people who care for people because the healthcare system or the infrastructure is just not working, and that it's also in general not really strong. That reminds me of the situation of Veronica Gago, where she said, who is saving us or protecting us is the community workers and not the state, because the state is just refusing to do this work and hand it over to those workers. Julia, do you want to react to this maybe? There were a lot of aspects that were quite important, I think, and that are also related to this question from the chat. So the question is, what could be concrete approaches we can do in this situation of the pandemic? How could they look like? Maybe you can react to this and then we can finish.
And I would try to keep it short and maybe a little in bullet points. But nevertheless, I'd like to come back to the question of collective care practices. What you described is practices evolving in a crisis because they are necessary or because there are voids that otherwise would not be filled, which is very important. And those networks can be starting points to think about different ways of relating to each other. Still, I would like to bring another aspect to the discussion. When talking about collective care practices, I mean something like care as health care, as social infrastructure. So I'm talking about care with the perspective of socialization of other property forms. So it can't be that healthcare is being organized in private hospital providers that are doing business for profit. It's organized in a capitalist way. So a perspective on care structures in society demands other ways and means of production. So this opens up the question on democracy. Who decides on what we understand as good care? And this again opens up the question of who is being involved in defining dignified care. And moreover, we have to ask ourselves, what are embedded gender-specific devaluations? So what are supposedly natural feminine practice you don't have to learn in care work? We have to break with those thoughts. So what is collective and socialized forms of care practices? To make it more concrete, at the moment, forms of property, forms of production, democracy, and genderization, we cannot decide on our own or in a collective manner. The hospitals are economized and they work for profit. So there is a property structure that there is public ownership, but also there's private ownership, which strives for profit, revenue, naturally. So the force of action in hospitals always are in favor of what can you do, how can we pay, how can we save costs, reduce costs. So we have to think about all that when we talk about collective care practices. What I said earlier, who decides what good care means? If care workers talk about they would like to do a foot bath for patients because it has a lot to do with mental health of the people in the hospital and about their well-being. That has to do with, for example, participation process of participation of carers in denouncing good care work. So when even among colleagues that is being regarded as like emotional ribbons, we have to change that. So emotional care work practice on an abstract, on a concept level, and we have to find different forms of democracy and of gendered devaluation. With that, I would conclude on that. Thank you, Julia. I would have another question. I would like to go back to 2 points you just mentioned. Is that possible? Well, of course, if we keep it short, we can elaborate. Something that's very important is what does it mean to be well-being?
Entonces, uno es el cuidado para estar bien en el marco del sistema capitalista para ejercer un sistema reproductivo, pero el otro, cuáles son nuestros límites como defensores y como acompañantes. El segundo punto que vimos mucho es cómo manejar qué es lo organizativo y qué es lo personal. Es un dilema bastante complejo.
Quickly, who defines what is being organized and what responsibility does the organization have? What responsibility does the individual have? In many organizations, we had the question for men, especially, to find the fault, to find the mistake. And this notion of care was taken on very differently. When we look on healthcare system and care through a political perspective, we see that we have to move towards the collective from the side of women and queers as well as of men. You take up very important aspects on that and very central question. The question of gendered circumstances was not discussed a lot today. I found that both of you found very enlightening statements to conclude. So maybe we don't even have to find some important last words. So Julia, what you said, we have to rupture those notions, those supposedly very strict notions of how care is being organized, how social infrastructure that comes out of this is very precarious. So thank you very much for this discussion. It was very different perspectives, not only the political context you're moving in, also your positions you're speaking from are very different, your approaches are very different. And yet we could show that in struggles around care work, that is something that has its ambiguous sides, which is not new, but from your very different perspectives, it got very clear what is important, what practices come from that. So that remains a discussion. We can't close this topic here, but thanks a lot at this point. Thank you, Medico, Jule Manik, Usche Merck, Susanne Heek, everyone doing work behind the scenes. Timo Dorsch, for example, who facilitated the chat. Enterprise Interpreting Collective, of course, for your interpreting work. That was very important in order for us to get into an exchange today. And last but not least, thanks to Andrea Schuld, who works in tech with Medico. In 2 weeks, we have Eva von Redeker and Nadia Mahmoud talking about the title Longing for a Revolution for Life. which will be the last session of the series of lectures, and which will open up a broader perspective on revolution for life. Thank you a lot, and I wish you all a pleasant evening.
Muchas gracias.
Auch von meiner Seite vielen Dank und vielen Dank.
Thanks from my side. Thanks, Jana, for moderation, and thanks, Clemencia, for the discussion.